What is really going on, crypto savages? You are listening to the CoinSpice podcast with host C. Edward Kelso, editor-in-chief at CoinSpice.io, your home for spicy crypto things on the net.
All right, so this is a really cool opportunity for the CoinSpice community to get an inside look here at the goings-on in Hong Kong, which is grabbing headlines really all over the world. And we have with us this particular episode, Joey B., who is based in Hong Kong. First off, how do you actually get to Hong Kong? Like, what's your kind of backstory?
What's my kind of backstory? Well, basically, I was actually born in the UK. I grew up between Hong Kong and the UK, so I sort of bounced in between. I went to school in Hong Kong. I went to school in the UK. Went to university in the UK. And I worked in the UK for quite a bit of time, and then I came back to China. Actually, I went to China first to do some work there, and then I moved to Hong Kong, and then I was working in Hong Kong. Then I left my job, started my business, and yeah, so that's basically me now.
Very cool. And so you've been living and working there for a while, yeah?
In Hong Kong, yes. I think I've been here like I think like 8 years now, something like that, 8 or 9. Wow. Yeah.
So in that 8 years, for people who've not been to Hong Kong, Westerners especially kind of see it as this economic oasis. How would you describe Hong Kong generally?
I would say they are correct. It is an economic oasis in many ways. I mean, in terms of, obviously, I lived a long time in the UK, so I do have sort of a Western comparison. You know, the taxes are very high in the UK. It's a lot less pro-business. There's a lot of like health and safety regulations. So you know, that free market dynamism is still really going on in Hong Kong. I would say that most of the assumptions about Hong Kong are probably correct, if that makes sense. In terms of that, it's this very economically free place. You know, it's sort of, you know, suffered in the past, you know, since the return of Hong Kong from the UK to China, it has slowly had certain things eroded. That's a very complicated topic. I'm sure we'll talk, you know, some about that. You know, certain things have been taken away from Hong Kong, and certain things have been happening. But in general, you know, if anyone from the West comes to Hong Kong, I think they will still be be impressed by, you know, the free market capitalism here. You know, the infrastructure. You know, it's a beautiful city. You know, there are lots of things. You know, I mean, there's a reason it's still a world famous city. You know, it's not a wasteland, you know, if that's what people think it might be, you know, I don't know what people in the West think.
And I mean, it's per capita. I mean, people there, you know, that has, I believe I've heard all sorts of weird statistics and trivia about the number of billionaires there and so on. So there's a lot of money sloshing around in Hong Kong. Yeah,
there's a lot of money. I mean, Hong Kong is a very important Asia financial hub. It's not as important as it used to be due to various reasons. Obviously, the growth of Asia in general and such. But yeah, like in terms of per capita, like Hong Kong has very high living standards. It's like, you know, well, I think one of the longest life expectancy, you know, average life expectancies like in the world, you know. Very highly educated, you know, all that stuff. So, yeah, I mean, it's rich. Obviously, I guess, I don't know if you were going to follow up. Obviously, there is a huge income inequality problem in Hong Kong, and
this is something that I saw that you wrote a little bit about in a chat room we both frequent, and I found that really interesting because it's not something I really hear about. But you're saying there is a kind of a big disparity there.
There is a massive disparity. I think Hong Kong has, I don't know, I don't have my data here, but I think it has one of the highest Gen I coefficients in the world, which is like a measurement for inequality. Surprisingly, you know, for a place that, you know, if you go out to the streets, there's just Mercedes and Rolls Royce and Lambos and all this stuff, right? Apparently 1 in 5 Hong Kong people live in poverty. And I actually recently saw a statistic which said that basically about 80% of Hong Kong people earn less than 20,000 Hong Kong dollars. To give you that's about like 2,500 USD a month, and the rent here, like if you get a like flat, will easily be like 1,500 USD a month, like for comparison. So there is a huge. I mean, this is actually partly, in my opinion, where a lot of the social, discontent, sort of breeds from, is that we do have this really deep economic problem in Hong Kong.
Do you think that's a function of Hong Kong being returned formally to mainland China, and people from the West coming there and trying to make a go of it, or am I misunderstanding that?
Hong Kong is it's kind of like inside China. It's like a special district, so you can't actually move from China to Hong Kong. Like if you move from China to Hong Kong, you actually have to go through immigration process. So it's actually like they have a specific quota per year of how many immigrants they can bring in. Hong Kong does actually have quite a tough immigration system.
That's fascinating. Okay, because that was my assumption, that maybe people from the rural areas were coming into Hong Kong and therefore skewing that Gini coefficient in the way that you said. But that's probably not the case then, due to their immigration restrictions. So. Yeah, you kind of began to touch on it, and I found that interesting too. That you're not giving too much credence to some of the conspiracy theories about U.S. involvement. But before we jump too far into that, protests in Hong Kong prior to this were fairly infrequent. Am I right about that?
Yes, that is correct. I mean, these protests. I mean, they do have like strikes. And they do have, I mean, we are legally allowed to do protests and stuff. So there have been things, but on this level and this scale, very, very rare. I mean, I think historically, the last time was like 1970 something, when the Brits were still around.
Got it. And so this particular round of protests was sort of a perfect storm. Is that correct? Like there's
definitely.
From what I hear, there was a I guess kind of a salacious love triangle murder that happened in Taiwan or something, and it sort of spilled out. Can you sort of take us through that a little bit, sort of the highlights?
Sure. So basically, what happened was that there was a murder case in Taiwan, and this Hong Kong guy, killed his girlfriend in Taiwan and then escaped to Hong Kong, and there was no way they could basically extradite him out of Hong Kong from Taiwan. So they wrote up this bill that basically would legally allow you to do that, because they had no such mechanism. So the actual real story behind this, no one really knows. But what I've heard from sort of inside sources is that apparently in the Hong Kong administration, this is some genius thought it was a very good idea to basically take this bill and use that, to win some favor from Beijing, to also happen to use this bill to say, okay, well, if we're going to do extradition, why don't we do extradition to China too? And then they wrote that into the bill. And then that's how the thing kind of spiraled out of control, because the Hong Kong, as I heard, the Hong Kong administration was trying to actually curry favor from the mainland government, because they wanted to look good or whatever, kill two birds with one stone, as they call it. And then obviously, that's how the Chinese part of the bill got added. Now, in terms of whether this bill is needed or not, absolutely not, because Taiwan has already come out and said that they don't even want this bill. Like even Taiwan, I mean, Taiwan is the one that would benefit from this bill being passed, right? Because they would get there are other mechanisms of getting this guy back to Taiwan, and even the Taiwanese government has said that we don't want you to do this bill. So it's absolutely bullshit that basically they're going, oh, we have to do this bill because of this Taiwan case. That's not true at all.
That's really interesting, because there's at least two tensions happening here, and one that I haven't allowed you to kind of go into too deeply yet is that mainland China is officially a communist government. Hong Kong is its sort of, as we've discussed, a little economic oasis and kind of one country, two systems idea economically. And then Taiwan is a whole mess, outside of that, where they're trying to be recognized as a sort of a separate entity, and China still has claims on that. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. Though I would say that I don't know how am I supposed to respond to that one, but I would say that it's actually pretty funny because for the whole idea that China wants to go for is basically that Taiwan is part of China, right? They want Taiwan to be part of China, but this whole thing they're doing in Hong Kong is just making all the Taiwanese go, fuck this. This is like, why would we want this? You know what I mean? It's like, it's totally.
I find that fascinating. Yeah.
Because, like they're going like one country, two systems. It works great. Look at Hong Kong. It's working great right now. So it's definitely like, this whole thing has definitely made everyone that's considered even thought of joining China kind of rethink about it and go and thinking like, well, if this is what we're gonna get, then it's not really gonna go down well, right? Is it?
And so Hong Kongers then are, at least some of them, those that have taken to the streets at various points, are worried that they will be essentially enveloped, that the existing protections that as you say kind of separate the two, mainland and Hong Kong, will be eroded through this extradition proposal, right?
I think there are sort of a few points to that particular comment. Number one, I feel like this has been brewing in Hong Kong for a long time. Like, there are lots of problems in Hong Kong, lots of things the Chinese government did, there's a huge lack of economic opportunity in Hong Kong for people that are poor. I guess I should go into this because it's kind of important. The root cause of everything in Hong Kong, in my opinion, is that there is this huge problem in Hong Kong where the property is really, really, really expensive. Because what the government does is that officially the government has very low tax, but the government owns all the land, and they highly restrict that land supply. So they only sell very little bits of that land at a small piece. So it's kind of like, it's a socialism. It's a socialist mechanism. And they raise money by selling that land, right? They price control. So essentially it's a subsidy for landlords, right? So what has happened in Hong Kong is that everything in Hong Kong essentially is really, really expensive because of this government thing. They raise money by selling land, which is actually a kind of taxation that people don't really understand. So when people come to Hong Kong and they go, oh, everything's very expensive, it's not because the demand is really there. Like, yeah, sure, the demand is part of it, but it's also like it's unreasonably expensive because all the rent prices and everything is like basically propped up, right, by this like really screwed up system. And
it's just completely artificial.
It's completely artificial. So it goes, the money all goes to government, and they completely waste it. I mean, there's very little social welfare in Hong Kong, which is kind of funny considering that they raise so much money from the land sales and all that. And so I don't want to go too deep into that because that can go forever. But basically, this is ruining the entire economics of the Hong Kong oasis. We talk about economic oasis, right? So the economic oasis is getting tainted by this problem of, well, you start a business, you're paying so much rent unless your restaurant is like full, to the max, like every day, right? You basically go bankrupt because the rent is that ridiculous, right? So it's essentially a really heavy tax. And this has a huge effect on social mobility for Hong Kong people. So we talked about the one in five people in Hong Kong living in poverty, and that's kind of the reason why, because they're getting really heavily taxed on the property side by the government. So going back to the protest, basically, to me, a lot of it is just all this stuff is just coming out. Like all these problems are just coming out, and the extradition bill was the trigger. Like, will the extradition bill actually affect most Hong Kong people? Probably not. I mean, I don't think most people would really be under the threat of, being
Mhm.
extradited to China, right? I mean, they might say a few things about President Xi Jinping, but I don't think that will get you extradited to China. But I feel like this was like the thing that pushed it over the edge, if you know what I mean. Like this was like the light, the Tinder match in basically like this thing that was gonna blow up. So it was always there, but this was like the line they kind of crossed. And the second point I have about this is I feel like the original people that organized the protest and they did this pro-democracy, this freedom stuff, it's out of their control at this point. Like this stuff is totally viral. Like whatever they planned, I think they're no longer in control. Like if you know what I mean, it's kind of spread to all these other districts. It started off as actually like a student movement. It was like very intellectual. It was very, young people. Now you have like grandmas and like taxi drivers and like construction workers like coming out and go, throwing rocks and stuff like that. So it's kind of like a democracy PR campaign, but it's completely like gone off the hook. Like it's like totally like worked and it just exploded into this thing that even the people that are supposed to lead it are no longer in control in any way whatsoever anymore.
It's kind of lost its focus.
I wouldn't say it's lost its focus. I think it's still very focused, but I would say that I feel like no one is in control of this anymore. There's no one who can come out and go like, let's stop. Let's put an end to this. Let's come out and make it. There's no talking heads of any kind for the movement. It would be like if you're a company and you launched a viral campaign and the viral campaign just kind of like went off the rails and really became viral and there was nothing you can do about it. Or like, you set a forest on fire and then you like basically it starts lighting up all the like, adjacent bushes or something like that.
Sure.
Bad analogy.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant analogy. And so you've seen this firsthand. I caught wind of it through really social media where people living and working in Hong Kong were suddenly beginning to post pictures of cash, Hong Kong dollars being left and various coins being left on top of train machines. And I didn't really at first get the significance of that. And there was talk about how essentially there's an octopus card, and that is used for everything from basic payments through even recording attendance at school in some areas. And so it's like this really uber convenient card, but also tracks basically your geolocation and where you're going and so on. And so people were beginning in Hong Kong as they started to protest to not use that to make their transit trips to protest locations. And so stuff like that, I began to see that rolling out, but I didn't really get a sense of the proportion until much later as to how many people were actually involved in this thing. What have you seen on the ground there? Like, it must be a massive swell.
Well, we actually, interesting enough, there's a group of people in Hong Kong that from Bitcoin Cash that sort of funded a campaign.
Oh, wow.
They basically saw that and they realized, wait, hey, these people are like, they're obviously starting to realize all this government track stuff is eventually gonna bite them in the ass, right, so to speak. So they were like, well, this is the perfect time to talk about decentralized money and how if you don't own your own money, then you don't really have any money, right? If your money is all like tracked and controlled by the government, which is essentially, I don't know how much you know about China, but in China everything is WeChat Pay now, so it's all digital. There's no cash. It's all everything's tracked by the government. So whatever you pay, they can see exactly what you buy, where you go, what you eat. They track your faces and all that stuff, right? So in Hong Kong they did a BCH campaign. They made like water bottles and umbrellas with like the Bitcoin Cash stuff on it, and they were giving those out. So that was really cool. Yeah, that was really cool. And I guess that's just that's a really nice microcosm of like how this movement in many ways is just completely like grassroots. It's just people really passionate about being free from that centralized authoritarian thing and everyone is just like, business owners and people and students are all just coming together to basically like fund this thing in different ways. Yeah.
It's interesting to see what will actually come of it without kind of our traditional understanding of protests and having a central, focal point in terms of a person or a leader. That's super interesting. I didn't. Now that you're saying it, it kind of makes sense. But was this did you anticipate something like this occurring, or did this sneak up on you like it did everybody else, or did you just start to notice one day when you walked outside, you went, "Holy mackerel"?
It completely surprised me. I mean, obviously, I was there actually in 2014 in the original like Hong Kong protest. That was the one that sort of started it all. And in that one, I wouldn't say they were defeated, but in the end, they called it off. Had some negotiations with the Hong Kong government, and ultimately nothing came of it. The government basically did nothing after all the protests and all the talk. So my assumption was that at that point I thought the Hong Kong people were crushed. I was like, they're not going to do another one. Basically, like I was like, I was thinking they were going to go through the 5 stages of grief or whatever, right? Like basically it'd be like, there's finally like. At first they'll be angry, and then like in the end they'll just kind of like accept that, hey, Hong Kong is part of China, and there's nothing you can do to overturn this. So
right.
when this new protest happened, I was honestly very, very surprised by. I guess I would say I'm proud of the spirit that Hong Kong people have, like even in the face of that, like as we talked. As I talked about before, that in the end Hong Kong is owned by China. Hong Kong is part of China, so. In a way, where do they want to go with this? But I think that spirit is really admirable. I mean, they're definitely braver than me. I mean, those protesters going out and chucking bricks at the police station and stuff like that. I mean, I would.
It is Bambi versus Godzilla. I mean,
it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah.
We tend to think here in the West that maybe China and Hong Kong are on some kind of parallel, or I'm not sure what we're doing here, but it's not nearly getting as much coverage in terms of that outsized, battle. I mean, China has, millions and millions and millions and millions of soldiers. I mean, this is not a fair fight, right?
It's not. But also, that brings a very interesting point. Is that in a way, what you're seeing in Hong Kong is really a clash of ideologies. Like Hong Kong has always been a place where East meets West, right? Like it's kind of famous for that, Bruce Lee. I mean, I'm sure everyone's kind of like heard or seen Hong Kong culture in some form or matter, right? Like in Blade Runner or whatever. And this is the first time like where it's really been out in the open, where we're really seeing that the values of Western liberty and democracy is just really, really incompatible with, Chinese, like, communism and socialism and that very centrally managed, government style. And in a way, I would say that it's actually like bigger than people think, because literally, I think a lot of people are kind of going like, well, this is a huge. It's kind of like the battle between like USA and Soviet Russia, right? You had that huge clash of ideologies, and they ended up having all these like sort of proxies where you had these people basically, I mean, remember in Germany, like East and West Germany, right?
Right. What do you think ultimately will come of all this? I've seen now flights being canceled. It definitely is. At least every weekend this thing pops off. The last I'd heard, the provincial governor or what would amount to, a mayor here in the States of Hong Kong, basically acknowledged shelving the extradition bill for a time, and that was almost eerily parallel with talks of capital flight of people with a lot of money moving, say, into Singaporean dollars or whatever.
Yes.
But what if you have a crystal ball, like what kind of pressure is this putting on? Do you see on the ground and on the street on the government to actually? I mean, do you think heads will ultimately be cracked? I've asked you probably 6 questions in this one question, but Try to give you sort of a general vibe there.
Yeah, no, I got your vibe. I really, really don't know. I mean, this is a very, I mean, everyone in Hong Kong is thinking the same thing. Everyone in Hong Kong is kind of going like, we really don't know where this is going to end. Like, and we just don't know. Like the only way this will, end well is that the government in Hong Kong or the government in Beijing gives some concessions. And, the concessions would be, for example, to really shelve the extradition bill for good, withdraw it, and not just basically have it like, frozen. And really investigate some of these police brutality things, which is what the protesters are asking for. I think if, I obviously I'm in Hong Kong, so I speak to a lot of Hong Kong people, and everyone I talk to is basically like, that's what scares them. They really have no idea like how it's going to end. And I think everyone's hoping that it's not going to end catastrophically. Yeah.
And that's, Beijing is in, and I obviously have no sympathy for them, but Beijing is in kind of a tight spot here going forward, because you don't want to kind of set a weird precedent in the sense of, the more you rattle the cage, the better circumstances you ultimately get. And then on the other hand, I mean, is this extradition bill ultimately worth all the hassle and, cost and disruption? And I would have thought by now they would have made some sort of concession just to ease this burden a little bit.
I don't know, but I will say that, in the background of this, don't forget that you also have the U.S. and China trade war, which I also feel like is actually part of the equation. And I don't think that it's directly this is directly being used as like a thing, in the negotiations, but that's obviously looming in the background, that you do have this dynamic between Xi Jinping and President Trump that basically they are, as far as I read last time, the trade deal is going all wrong. So I feel like that, I think to give a bit of background, like Hong Kong is treated differently by the USA. So Hong Kong has a special trade agreement with the USA. So all these tariffs and all this stuff Trump is doing does not apply to Hong Kong, because the US actually does treat Hong Kong like a separate country.
That's legally. A great point.
So that's on the table, actually. So basically, if it gets to the point where, I could totally imagine that's actually on Trump's table right now, that, hey, if you wanna like, pressure China, you can actually do stuff to Hong Kong and like, sanction it, or, revoke this trade agreement you have with Hong Kong. And there's a lot of talk in Hong Kong about it, and everyone's very worried. And I think people are very worried in Hong Kong that ultimately, if China does, say, do what people fear, then ultimately the US will kind of go like, well, Hong Kong is just another Chinese city, so why should we not have tariffs on Hong Kong when we have tariffs on the rest of China, right?
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, no, it's a really big thing, actually. It's a really big thing, because so once you kind of factor into that, then it gets even more complicated, right? Then you realize that on China's side, they're not just thinking about Hong Kong as a place where it's just having this like revolt, right? They're also going like, well, Hong Kong is this place where the US can bring the trade war into it. And that makes it very, very, I would say interesting, but it's also very, very like a mindfuck, for lack of a better word.
Now that you mentioned it, my head is swimming. But you mentioned which is red meat for CoinSpice podcast listeners here, and that is the cryptocurrency aspect of it. You said BCHers, Bitcoin cashers, got involved early with well, can you explain sort of the rationale? I think there's at least two reasons for having, say, umbrellas, why that's significant, and especially now, water bottles. Why, can you kind of go into that a little bit more as to why those two items are of particular importance to protesters?
Well, obviously, umbrellas is the symbol of like the Hong Kong protests. That really came in the first protests when they used umbrellas as shields against the tear gas that is constantly being rained on them in the protest, and against the police charges and stuff like that. The water bottle is obviously like, I mean, people need water, number one, and number two. And number two, it actually helps you wash like I think if you drink it, it helps your tear gas a little bit. But the main we didn't choose those items. We chose items because they were just kind of like essential items in the protests. That's why they were chosen, and they were easy to kind of like quickly manufacture and stick the Bitcoin Cash label, and really promote this idea of decentralized currency. Basically, because they're connected, right? Totally. I mean, obviously, in CoinSpice or CoinSpicers are basically behind this idea of a currency that's not controlled by government, right? So I feel like the idea of liberty and the idea of Bitcoin are totally connected. Yeah. And what's interesting is that the BCH. The way we got into it is because we kind of realized, we look at these protests, I'm like, whoa, like this is like a huge like anti-government like movement, and there's no Bitcoin involved. Like nobody even knows what Bitcoin is. And that was kind of like when we went like, we should do something, right? Because it's so weird that kind of like this would be like one of the reasons why Bitcoin exists, right? And yet it's not being promoted or attached in any way to, resistance of the government.
That is fascinating. And so this is an opportunity then to kind of spread the idea of not only decentralized protests and the power of those, but ultimately what gets governments to react and allows people some modicum of freedom is in controlling their own money. And there's a lot of talk now, speaking of the trade war, that people in China are bidding up the price of cryptocurrencies as a result. I'm somewhat skeptical about that, but because it makes so much sense to me, it's almost too good to be true. But what are your thoughts before I let you go here on things like the protest and the trade war and their overall impact on cryptocurrency usage or adoption?
I feel like China has been a big part of cryptocurrency, for a long time. If not, it's probably like a huge portion of the entire, cryptocurrency economy. And the reason for that is very simple. I mean, because the Chinese, when they make the money or they have the money, they want to be free, right? And obviously, China wants to not have that money. They want to track that money and not have that money leave the country, right? So ultimately, whatever China does, and they've tried to do a lot of things to Bitcoin remains like a huge, highly desirable asset in China because it can be used to avoid the Chinese government, basically.
Really appreciate you staying up and doing this. It was a very short notice, and wow, I just learned a ton. And lastly, make sure you stay safe. All right.
Yes, I will do. And no, thanks for having me on the podcast.